Imagine a moment in history when one decision by a single person changed everything for millions of people. We go back to the early 1930s, when the world's money system worked very differently than today. We meet King George V of the British Empire, and we see how his choices about money created one of the biggest financial disasters the modern world has ever known. In 1929, something terrible happened in America. The stock market suddenly crashed. All the money that people thought they had simply disappeared. Banks that people trusted started to fail. People rushed to take their money out, but the banks could not give it back. This crash was the start of something much bigger that would spread across the entire world. By 1931, the world was in real trouble. Banks were failing in many countries. People who had worked for years and saved their money found their savings were worthless. Businesses were closing. Workers were losing their jobs every day. The world was falling into what we now call the Great Depression, one of the darkest times in modern history. At the center of all this trouble was Britain and its capital city, London. At that time, Britain was not just any country. It was the most important financial center in the entire world. Think of London like the heart of the world's money system. Almost all international trade ran on British credit. British banks lent money to other countries. The British pound was the currency that people around the world trusted the most. And behind all this belief and trust was something very simple but very powerful: gold. Now we need to understand how money worked back then. The system was called the gold standard. Every piece of paper money that a country printed had to be backed by real gold sitting in a vault somewhere. If you held a pound note, that was a promise that somewhere in a British bank, there was real gold that belonged to you. This system kept countries honest. Everyone believed that gold was real money, and paper was just a promise to give you gold if you asked. This system worked fine when times were good and people trusted each other. But when times got bad and people got scared, everything changed. When investors started to worry about Britain's money, they stopped believing in the promise. They wanted the gold, not the paper. They started asking for their gold back. This is called a run on the banks. The bank cannot give everyone their money at once because it does not have that much gold. So gold started to flow out of Britain like water running out of a broken pipe. Britain faced a serious problem in 1931. Foreign investors were starting to pull their money out of Britain. They wanted to move their gold somewhere safer. British banks were losing their gold reserves day after day. The government was very worried. They were afraid that soon they would not have any gold left. They were afraid that other countries would stop trusting British money. It was a moment of real fear and panic in the highest places of British government. So what did the British government do? Here is where the story gets really interesting. And this is the part that caused so much damage. Instead of trying to create more money and make it easier for businesses and people to borrow, the government did the exact opposite. They believed that the way to save the pound was to show that they were strong and disciplined. They thought that if they cut government spending, raised interest rates, and increased taxes, then investors would see that they were serious about protecting the gold standard. But this was exactly the wrong thing to do. Imagine that your car is going too fast and you are about to crash. You slowed down by using the brakes. But what if someone told you that the best way to save yourself was to actually take fuel out of the car? That does not make sense, right? Well, that is what the British government was doing to their economy. They were cutting government spending, which meant less money in people's pockets. They were raising interest rates, which made it very expensive for people and businesses to borrow money. They were increasing taxes, which took money away from people that needed it most. The result was terrible. Factories began to close because there were no customers to buy the things they made. People lost their jobs in huge numbers. Unemployment rose so high that in some cities, 1 out of every 4 workers had no job. Trade between countries slowed down because people and businesses had no money to buy from other countries. The economy was getting weaker and weaker, but the government kept defending the gold standard. Still, the gold kept leaving Britain. This went on for several months. The government was fighting a losing battle. No matter what they did, the gold kept leaving. Investors kept losing faith in the British pound. Finally, in September of 1931, something had to give. The British government and the Bank of England decided they could no longer defend the gold standard. On September 21st, 1931, Britain left the gold standard. The government announced that the pound would no longer be backed by gold. The pound would float, which means its value would go up and down based on what people were willing to pay for it. When the news came out, what happened next was very fast and very dramatic. the pound lost a lot of its value almost instantly. People had been holding British pounds because they thought the pounds were as good as gold. Now suddenly, the pounds were not backed by anything. They were worth much less. Investors found that their money had lost a huge amount of value in just days. They panicked even more. All over the world, people who owned British money started to pull it out and move it to other countries. But here was the problem. Britain was not the only country on the gold standard. Many other countries around the world had tied their own currencies to the British pound. They believed that the British pound was safe and would always be backed by gold. When Britain suddenly left the gold standard, all these countries were in trouble too. Investors in these countries panicked just like in Britain. The panic spread like fire. Money started to run out of countries all over Europe. Banks that had been trusted for hundreds of years started to fail. Credit markets froze up. Nobody wanted to lend money anymore because nobody knew who was safe. International trade started to collapse. Within a few months, international trade had fallen by more than 60%. The amount of buying and selling between countries fell to less than half of what it had been before. It is hard to understand what this really meant for ordinary people. Imagine if you were a farmer in Argentina and you had agreed to sell your wheat to a company in Britain. You had agreed on a price and shipped the wheat. But by the time it arrived, the pound had lost so much value that the money you got for your wheat could barely buy you a cup of tea. Imagine if you were a factory worker in Germany and your factory sold things to Britain. Suddenly, the factories in Britain could not afford to buy from you anymore because their money was worth so much less. Your factory had to close. You lost your job. Millions of people lost their jobs because of this crash in international trade. The countries that had stayed on the gold standard longer suffered even more. When they finally did leave the gold standard, it was too late. They had already lost so much of their business. Their economies were so weak that they took much longer to recover. But the countries that left the gold standard early were able to start recovering sooner. This was an important lesson. Staying too long with a system that is not working can cause more damage than admitting you were wrong and changing course. The consequences went far beyond just money and economics. Fortunes disappeared. People's life savings simply vanished. Families that had been wealthy became poor overnight. But there were other consequences too. When people lose everything, they get angry and desperate. They look for someone to blame. They look for a strong leader who promises to fix everything. In the early 1930s, this is exactly what happened in many countries. Political movements that promised simple answers began to grow. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler began to gain support because people were desperate and angry. The economic collapse that started with Britain leaving the gold standard helped create the conditions that would eventually lead to World War II. Now, what did the world learn from all this? The lesson was very clear. A rigid money system that does not allow flexibility can turn a bad situation into a disaster. Central banks around the world learned that sometimes you have to do unusual things to protect the economy and people's jobs. They learned that defending a system that is broken is more dangerous than admitting you were wrong and changing course. Sometimes you have to print money and lower interest rates. Sometimes the most important thing is to keep the system working and to keep people employed and fed. This lesson is very important for understanding the world today. The world economy is very different now than it was in 1931. We do not have the gold standard anymore. Countries can print money whenever they want. Central banks can do things that would have seemed crazy in 1931. But why do they do these things? Why do governments print trillions of dollars during a crisis? The answer is because they remember 1931. They remember what happened when Britain was too rigid and did not provide enough money and credit when times were bad. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, the banks and car companies in America were about to fail. The economy was about to collapse, just like in 1931. But this time, the government and the central bank did the opposite of what Britain did. They printed massive amounts of money. They lowered interest rates to almost zero. They did everything they could to keep money flowing through the economy and keep people employed. And it worked. The economy recovered much faster than it would have if the government had tried to cut spending and raise taxes like Britain did. The same thing happened again in 2020 when a virus called COVID-19 shut down the whole world. Governments and central banks printed trillions of dollars. They handed out money to people and businesses to help them survive. The economy did not collapse like it did in the 1930s. People kept their jobs and their homes. The memory of 1931 shaped these decisions. But now we must ask, Today, the total amount of debt is higher than ever. Global markets are more connected. Money moves electronically around the world. If trust breaks down again, panic could spread much faster. If another crisis came tomorrow, would governments know what to do? We can only hope the lessons of 1931 are remembered clearly. The story of King George V and his decision to defend the gold standard teaches us something very important. Money is real only because people believe it is real. When that belief breaks down, money stops working. Capital runs away. Businesses close. People lose their jobs. The choices leaders make about money affect millions of lives. They are choices about whether people will have jobs and homes. This is why 1931 matters. It shows how one decision could cause suffering. The king thought he was defending the empire. He thought showing strength and discipline would make people trust him more. But the opposite happened. His choice deepened the worst economic collapse in modern history. It led to suffering for millions and helped set the stage for a terrible war. So what is the lesson? The lesson is that the strong thing to do is admit when something is not working and change course. The lesson is that defending a broken system is not strength. The lesson is that flexibility is more important than rigid pride. The choices leaders make echo through time and affect people they will never meet. Today, more than 90 years later, we still live in a world shaped by 1931. Every time a central bank prints money during a crisis, they remember 1931. Every time a government helps people during hard times, they try to prevent the suffering of the Great Depression. But we must ask, have we really learned the lessons? Or are we just hoping that by printing money and creating more debt, we can avoid hard choices? Are we solving problems or pushing them into the future? We cannot answer with certainty. We can only hope that our leaders make wise choices when the next crisis comes. The story of the king whose decision sparked worldwide economic collapse is a warning for us today. It shows how powerful a single decision can be. It shows how one person's choice can reshape the entire world. It shows that we are all connected, all dependent on a system that works only because we believe it works. And it shows that protecting that system sometimes means being willing to change it, rather than defending it to the point of destruction.